the only agent who betrayed both the FBI and the cartels. There is a particular kind of darkness that lives in the space between allegiances, a shadow cast not by a single loyalty betrayed, but by two betrayals unfolding simultaneously, each feeding the other in an ever-tightening spiral. The story at the heart of this investigation belongs to that darkness. It is the story of a federal law enforcement officer who swore an oath to uphold the laws of the United States, who was entrusted with the most sensitive intelligence in the war on drugs, who was given access to the machinery of undercover operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and who used every single one of those privileges to systematically betray not only his own agency, but also the criminal organizations that had placed their lives and fortunes in his hands. This is not a story manufactured for entertainment. Every detail that follows has been drawn from court records, testimony, Inspector General reports, investigative journalism by the Associated Press, congressional testimonies, FBI case files, and the documented history of some of the most powerful criminal enterprises ever assembled on the North American continent. The names of individuals and cities have been omitted or altered to protect ongoing investigations and the safety of those involved. But the events themselves are real, documented, and historically verified. The timeline is accurate. The corruption is real. And the questions it raises about the institutions that were supposed to prevent it remain unanswered to this day. Before we go any further into this story, if you are watching this on our channel for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you never miss our new investigative documentaries. Stories like this one take months of research, and every subscriber helps us keep bringing them to you. Part 1. The Architecture of the Drug War, Setting the Stage, 1970s-1985. To understand how an agent of the law becomes a servant of the very criminals he hunts, one must first understand the world in which that transformation is made possible. The American war on drugs did not begin with a single declaration or a single enemy. It grew, like the cartels themselves, organically, feeding on desperation, money, political ambition, and the particular chemistry of power that emerges when enormous profits collide with inadequate oversight. By the mid-1970s, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration had established itself as the primary federal agency tasked with combating the flow of narcotics into the country. The DEA operated in dozens of countries, built networks of informants that stretched from the mountain jungles of South America to the corridors of European banking, and employed agents whose skills in undercover work, money laundering analysis, and cartel infiltration were among the most sophisticated in the world. The agency had real successes. It dismantled supply chains, arrested traffickers, and seized hundreds of millions of dollars in drug proceeds. But the DEA also operated in a world without adequate guardrails. Agents worked in countries where law enforcement corruption was endemic, where cartel money flowed freely into government offices, where the line between informant and co-conspirator was routinely blurred in the name of operational necessity. The agency had a specific legal authority, known as Attorney General Exempt Operations, that permitted its agents to actually launder money on behalf of cartels, not as a final end, but as a means of infiltrating financial networks and gathering intelligence that could lead to major arrests. These operations were supposed to be tightly monitored. In practice, as a 2020 Justice Department Inspector General report would later confirm, they were anything but. In the early 1980s, a parallel story was unfolding in Mexico, and it would prove to be one of the most consequential developments in the history of organized crime in the Americas. A cartel centered around the Gulf of Mexico, rooted in the state of Tamaulipas, had grown from a regional drug smuggling operation into a transnational criminal empire. Its leader had begun as a petty criminal, apprenticed in car theft under his uncle, one of the original organized crime figures of northeastern Mexico. By the mid-1970s, he had moved into marijuana trafficking, exporting product from Mexico into Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. By the early 1980s, cocaine had become the product of choice, and the cartel had established itself as a dominant force along the United States-Mexico border. What made this organization particularly dangerous and particularly relevant to the story that follows was not merely its volume of product or its reach across borders. What made it extraordinary was its sophisticated and systematic use of bribery. Court documents and testimony later established that the organization had developed an almost corporate approach to corrupting law enforcement. Money was categorized not as bribes, but as a form of taxation on business. Officials on both sides of the border were on the payroll. Prosecutors, police commanders, immigration officials, military officers, politicians. The payments were documented in ledgers that would eventually fall into investigators' hands, and what those ledgers revealed was staggering. The head of the Federal Judicial Police of Mexico was receiving the equivalent of $1 million a month. Operations commanders received half that. Local enforcement officials received smaller but still significant sums, commensurate with the intelligence value they could provide. It was within this context, this world of institutional corruption, of government agencies with almost no oversight of their most sensitive operations, of cartels that had effectively purchased significant portions of the law enforcement apparatus on both sides of the border, that an FBI agent operating in the border region in the mid-1980s made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Part 2, the first betrayal. When the badge becomes currency, 1986 to 1989. The FBI's investigation of the Gulf-based cartel had been underway for several years when, in 1986, a federal agent assigned to the case made testimony that rocked the investigation to its core. In the course of proceedings against the cartel's leadership, it emerged that this agent, an FBI special agent stationed in the border region, had been receiving bribes from the organization. The total documented in testimony exceeded $100,000. In exchange for this money, the agent had been leaking information directly to the cartel's leadership, the identities of informants, the movements of investigators, the nature and scope of ongoing surveillance operations. The consequences of these leaks were potentially lethal. Among the information compromised was the identity of at least one FBI informant operating inside the cartel's network, a person whose safety depended entirely on their anonymity being protected by the very agency that had recruited them. Beyond the direct threat to individual lives, the leaks had compromised the operational integrity of one of the most significant cartels. Investigations on the American side of the border. The cartel's leadership, now forewarned, had time to adjust, to relocate, to eliminate vulnerabilities, to destroy evidence. Court records and subsequent investigations also revealed something that elevated the agent's betrayal from ordinary corruption to something far more sinister. The cartel had not merely been using the agent as a passive source of information. According to testimony, the cartel had actively directed the agent, had issued instructions, had sought specific outcomes. In one documented instance, the cartel leader himself had reached out to the agent and asked him to use his law enforcement connections to take care of certain individuals who had disrupted cartel operations. The agent, according to testimony, had responded by having those individuals taken into custody, technically a law enforcement action, but one executed at the direct request of the criminal organization he was simultaneously supposed to be investigating. What this revealed was not merely corruption, but something close to operational merger. A federal law enforcement officer executing cartel directives while wearing a federal badge. The fiction of the investigation had become a vehicle for the cartel to neutralize its own enemies through the machinery of the American justice system. In 1989, the agent was removed from the case. No public criminal charges were brought. He retired from the FBI a year later. The cartel, led by a figure who by then had established himself as one of the most powerful drug lords in the world, continued to grow. By 1995, the cartel's leader had become so notorious, his empire so vast, his violence so well documented, that the FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list, making him the first drug trafficker in American history to achieve that distinction. He was ultimately arrested. In January 1996, captured outside a ranch in the northern Mexican state of Nuevo León. He was quickly extradited to the United States, tried and convicted. But the story of the corrupted FBI agent who had served him for years was not a central part of the public narrative surrounding that conviction. The agent had already faded into retirement. The full scope of what he had done, the full catalogue of intelligence he had compromised, the full human cost of the informants whose cover he had blown, these remained buried in testimony and sealed records. The cartel's leader would die in an American federal prison. The agent who had helped protect him for years would not face the same accounting. The architecture of this first betrayal, a federal agent serving a criminal empire while drawing a government salary, was not unique in American law enforcement history. But what makes it extraordinary is what it prefigured. A pattern that would emerge with far greater scale and institutional depth in the decades that followed. Part 3. The system that made betrayal possible. Inside the DEA's undercover architecture, 1990s-2005, the corruption of a single FBI field agent in the border region was disturbing. But in the years that followed, investigators and journalists would uncover something far more troubling. A systemic architecture within federal drug enforcement that had created the conditions for corruption on an industrial scale. Understanding this architecture is essential to understanding how the central figure of this story, the agent who would eventually be called the most corrupt in the history of federal drug enforcement, was able to operate for nearly a decade with almost no oversight, betraying both his agency and the criminal organizations he had befriended. The Attorney General Exempt Operation Program, known internally as AGEO, was a legal authority granted to the DEA that allowed its agents to conduct covert money laundering operations. On paper, the logic was sound. To infiltrate the financial networks of major drug cartels, agents needed to actually participate in those networks, moving money, establishing relationships with cartel money managers, and building the evidence needed to dismantle the entire financial infrastructure of a criminal enterprise. In practice, the program gave agents access to enormous sums of money, commissions charged to cartels for laundering their proceeds, with accountability mechanisms that the Justice Department's own Inspector General would later describe as woefully inadequate. A 2020 Inspector General report found that the DEA had failed since at least 2006 to file annual reports to Congress about these operations as required by law. The report documented a fundamental lack of oversight. Agents were running money laundering stings that generated millions of dollars in commission income, and the tracking of that money was so loose that significant sums could be diverted with minimal risk of detection. The report faulted the DEA for allowing operations to continue for years without meaningful evaluation of whether they were actually achieving their stated goals of disrupting cartel finances. Internal records later obtained by investigative journalists revealed that at one point there were 53 simultaneous AGEO operations running across the United States and internationally. Each of these operations involved front companies, shell bank accounts, international wire transfers, and relationships with some of the most dangerous money. launderers on the planet. The agents running these operations were, by operational necessity, in close and regular contact with the very criminals they were supposed to be investigating. The 2015 Inspector General report that preceded the larger 2020 review had already sounded serious alarms. That earlier report documented the DEA agents had participated in what investigators described as sex parties with prostitutes hired by Colombian drug cartels. The scandal was significant enough to prompt the suspension of several agents and the eventual retirement of the DEA's administrator. Yet the culture that made such behavior possible, the entanglement of law enforcement agents with the criminal networks they were investigating, the blurring of professional and personal relationships with cartel figures and their associates, the exploitation of commission funds for personal enrichment, persisted. It was into this environment that a rising star of the DEA was placed in the early 2010s, sent to an overseas posting in a coastal city known equally for its beauty and its role as a hub of Colombian drug trafficking. He arrived with an exemplary record, a reputation for skill in financial investigations, and the kind of personal ambition that had made him one of the agency's most promising young agents. He had passed through the system and emerged, at least on paper, exactly the kind of officer the DEA needed. What the agency's vetting process had failed to catch, or had caught and chosen to ignore, was that this agent had already demonstrated warning signs that should have disqualified him from his position. He had failed a polygraph examination. He had declared personal bankruptcy. He had maintained a close personal relationship with a suspected money launderer who would later become the godfather of his twin daughters. Each of these facts was known to the DEA. None of them prevented his promotion to one of the most sensitive postings in the agency's international operations. Part 4. The Second and Greater Betrayal. A Double Agent Against Everyone, 2009-2018. The agent arrived in Colombia in 2009, having joined the DEA that same year despite the failed polygraph. His first years in the agency were by all accounts genuinely productive. He oversaw undercover investigations that led to dozens of arrests and established a reputation in the Miami-based group as someone who understood the complex financial machinery of drug trafficking. He was seen as a rising star. His bosses recommended him for the overseas posting, and he transferred to the Colombian coastal city, a place where luxury and danger coexisted, where cartel money had built mansions along the waterfront, and where the line between the legitimate economy and the criminal economy had long since blurred beyond recognition. It was there in approximately 2011 that he first encountered the man who would become his primary criminal associate, a Colombian financier and smuggler who had already been identified by at least 5 separate federal law enforcement agencies as a major player in the trafficking of narcotics and the laundering of drug proceeds. The DEA's own Special Operations Division had flagged this individual as a consolidated priority target, the highest category of law enforcement focus reserved for the most significant and dangerous operators in the narco-financial world. The agent's initial contact with this figure was, at least on paper, legitimate. He opened an Attorney General exempt operation targeting the man's financial network, writing to senior Justice Department officials that the investigation aimed to strike what he described as a devastating blow against the target's operation. But even as the agent was composing those memoranda, the relationship was developing along very different lines. The target began showering the agent with gifts, expensive Swiss watches, luxury automobiles, cash payments, and eventually a condominium worth $750,000 in the city where they both operated. By 2013, the agent had done something that inverted the entire logic of the investigation. He converted his primary target from a subject of law enforcement scrutiny into a registered DEA informant. This was not inherently improper. Converting a target into an informant was a standard investigative technique. But in this case, the conversion was a fiction the agent was not using the informant relationship to gather intelligence against the cartel. He was using it to protect the financier from other law enforcement agencies that were still actively investigating him. Internal government records obtained through subsequent investigations documented what followed in stark detail. The agent steered DEA wire transfers, money that was supposed to be tracked and eventually seized directly to his associate's financial network. He provided what law enforcement describes as safe passage for containers of contraband. When other federal agencies began focusing on the financier, the agent actively worked to throw them off, telling a suspicious investigator from another agency that his informant was an open book and that the stories about him were fabricated. He was, in effect, using his DEA credentials as a shield for the very criminal enterprise he was supposed to be dismantling. And then there was the money. The agent's knowledge of the black market peso exchange, one of the most sophisticated money laundering mechanisms in existence, connecting drug sales in the United States to Colombian pesos through a network of international financial transactions, allowed him to manipulate the AGO operations in ways that were nearly invisible to outside scrutiny. He and his co-conspirators diverted approximately $9 million from undercover money laundering investigations into personal accounts. The proceeds purchased a $30,000 diamond ring from Tiffany's. They funded luxury sports cars. They paid for a primary residence in Florida, a vacation home in Puerto Rico, and the $750,000 condominium in Colombia. A property that the agent listed not in his own name, but in the name of his Colombian wife, whom he had met through the very social world surrounding the cartel figure he was supposed to be investigating. The lifestyle the agent was building bore no relationship to a federal agent's salary, and it was becoming increasingly visible to colleagues. Stories of yacht parties circulated through the DEA's Miami office. Other agents heard about the extravagant travel, the designer luggage, the gold hublot watch visible on his wrist. Years before any formal investigation was launched, prosecutors who worked with his group were aware of the incongruity between his stated income and his observable wealth. By the agent's own account, his behavior and the behavior of several colleagues was so well known within his immediate professional circle that it had essentially become normalized. But the agent was not merely stealing from his own government. He was also stealing from his cartel associate. The operation he was running was generating commission income, money the cartel paid to the DEA as the fee for laundering its proceeds, and a portion of that money was being diverted away from official accounts. The financier, who believed he had purchased the agent's protection and operational support, was paying fees that were not always going where he believed they were going. The relationship was not a partnership of equals. It was a double extraction. The agent was simultaneously taking from the American government and from the criminal empire that had enlisted his services. This is the precise moment at which the story becomes historically singular. Not merely an agent who had been corrupted by a cartel, but an agent who had become a parasite on both the institution he served and the criminal organization that believed it owned him. He had betrayed both sides simultaneously. He belonged to neither. He served only himself. The agent later described his psychological state during this period in terms that are both chilling and illuminating. He said he had come to believe, as he claimed, many of his colleagues had also come to believe, that the war on drugs was fundamentally unwinnable. He spoke about the sheer volume of narcotics leaving Colombia, about the impossibility of making any meaningful dent in the trade, about the way this institutional nihilism had corroded the ethical foundations of his work. He said he had become someone he no longer recognized. He said the lifestyle had consumed him. He said the informant had become like a father figure, that the relationship had long since passed beyond anything professional. What is striking about this account, and what investigators and journalists found partially corroborated in the thousands of pages of documents they reviewed, is not that the agent is lying. It is that he may be telling a version of the truth that reveals something deeply wrong with the institution that shaped him. The federal judge who sentenced him said from the bench that he was not the only one who had been corrupted, that others needed to be investigated, that this pattern had to stop. The prosecutorial record, however, did not extend beyond the agent himself. His colleagues moved quietly into retirement. The culture that had incubated the corruption remained, by most accounts, intact. Part 5, The Cartel Turns, How Betrayal Was Itself Betrayed, 2018. The agent's downfall came not from internal oversight, not from a rival agency's investigation, not from a whistleblower inside the DEA. It came from the world he had chosen to inhabit. The cartel world, with its own paranoia, its own systems of surveillance, its own brutal accounting of debts and deceptions. Specifically, his unraveling was precipitated by a Venezuelan-American informant who had been at the center of the money laundering operations and who eventually confessed to law enforcement investigators about the diversion of funds from the undercover stings. The informant described making cash payments directly to the agent. He described the mechanics of the scheme, the false reports filed with the DEA, the redirected wire transfers, the commission money that never reached official accounts. In doing so, he gave investigators the thread they needed to begin pulling at what would unravel as a $9 million tapestry of fraud, money laundering, and institutional betrayal. In 2018, the agent resigned from the DEA. His departure was preceded by growing awareness among colleagues and supervisors that something was seriously wrong, even if the full extent of the misconduct had not yet been formally documented. The resignation did not stop the investigation. Federal authorities continued building their case, reviewing financial records, interviewing witnesses, and assembling the documentary evidence that would eventually form the basis of a prosecution. In 2020, the agent was arrested. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to launder money, honest services wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, conspiracy to commit identity theft, and aggravated identity theft. He entered a plea of not guilty, a position he would maintain until the weight of evidence and the logic of his legal situation made a different calculation inevitable. The following year, he pleaded guilty to 19 federal counts. In court, he broke down in tears as he addressed the judge, saying that the greatest punishment he faced was the inability to explain to his young daughters why he would be absent from their lives for so long. He said that when he had first taken his oath as a federal law enforcement officer, he had done so with genuine pride. He said there came a moment when he made a decision that went against everything he was, that damaged his family, and embarrassed his country. He said he should have known better. In December 2021, a federal judge in Florida sentenced him to more than 12 years in federal prison. Before pronouncing the sentence, the judge delivered remarks that went beyond the immediate case. She expressed disgust at the DEA for the failures of oversight that had allowed the misconduct to persist for so long. She said directly that the agent was the one who had been caught, but that it was apparent to the court that there were others. She said the pattern had to stop. Her remarks were documented in court records and reported widely. The Justice Department declined to comment. The DEA issued a statement calling the agent a criminal who had violated his oath as a federal law enforcement officer and violated the trust of the American people. Several of the agent's former colleagues in the Miami-based group quietly retired. No other agents were charged in connection with the conspiracy. The agent's Colombian wife, who had been spared jail time on a money laundering charge in exchange for her husband's cooperation with prosecutors, filed for divorce. The $750,000 condominium in Cartagena, the Tiffany diamond ring, the luxury vehicles, the accumulated symbols of a decade of double betrayal were seized or liquidated as part of the legal proceedings. The financier who had viewed the agent as a son, who had paid him to protect his criminal empire from the very agency that employed him, continued to operate in Colombia, his own legal situation unresolved at the time of the agent's sentencing. Part 6. The Cartel that hacked the FBI, a parallel story of institutional vulnerability, 2018-2025. Even as the most corrupt agent in DEA history was being prosecuted, a parallel story was unfolding that demonstrated the cartel's capacity to penetrate federal law enforcement through entirely different means. A 2025 Justice Department Inspector General report revealed that a major Mexican cartel had, in 2018 or earlier, hired a computer hacker to conduct targeted surveillance of senior FBI officials operating in the Mexican capital. The hacker gained access to the city's extensive camera network and used it to track the movements of the FBI's assistant legal attaché, a senior agent whose role involved direct coordination with Mexican law enforcement on high-priority cases. The hacker was able to monitor who entered and exited the American embassy. The hacker was able to see calls made and received by the FBI official and access geolocation data that mapped the official's movements through the city. The operation ran without detection for an unknown period of time. The consequences were lethal. According to the Inspector General report, the cartel used the information gathered by the hacker to identify and locate potential FBI sources and cooperating witnesses. In some instances, these individuals were intimidated into silence. In other instances, they were killed. The report stated with clinical directness that the cartel used the information provided by the hacker to intimidate and, in some instances, kill potential sources or cooperating witnesses. The surveillance operation took place in the context of one of the FBI's highest priority cases, the investigation of a former Sinaloa cartel leader whose eventual arrest and extradition to the United States had required years of complex intelligence work across multiple agencies. The fact that the cartel had been able to monitor senior FBI personnel throughout this period raised profound questions about how much of the investigation's methodology had been compromised, about which sources had been identified by cartel surveillance, and about whether the cartel's eventual response, the murder of potential witnesses, had been more extensive than investigators were willing to publicly acknowledge. Senior officials within the FBI and its partner agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency, described the threat posed by this kind of ubiquitous technical surveillance in terms that the Inspector General report quoted directly. They called it existential, not dangerous, not serious, existential, meaning capable of threatening the fundamental ability of federal law enforcement to operate against criminal organizations that had the resources, technical sophistication, and organizational reach to monitor the monitors. The DEA's own assessment of cartel capabilities in the technology domain had been evolving along similar lines for years. Senior agency officials had publicly acknowledged that the major Mexican cartels, operations generating annual revenues in the billions of dollars, were employing specialists in cryptocurrency management, digital surveillance, and counterintelligence. The cartels, as one senior official put it, run a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise and utilize sophisticated technology to enhance their business operations. They utilize state-of-the-art surveillance techniques to identify law enforcement activities and their adversaries. What this parallel story revealed, in conjunction with the story of the corrupt DEA agent, was a picture of two simultaneous vulnerabilities. One internal, created by the corrosive effects of money and nihilism on individual agents operating without adequate oversight. The other external, created by the cartel's growing technical capacity to penetrate federal law enforcement through digital means. Together, these vulnerabilities created a threat to American drug enforcement that was not merely serious, but, in the assessment of senior officials, potentially structural. Part 7. The pattern extends. When expertise becomes a weapon against the state, 2017-2025. The story of the most corrupt DEA agent in American history did not exhaust the pattern it represented. In the years surrounding his prosecution, a series of related cases revealed the extent to which the problem of law enforcement corruption in the drug war had become systemic rather than individual, a product of institutional structures rather than merely personal moral failure. In 2017, the highest-ranking member of a specialized intelligence sharing unit that operated jointly between American and Mexican law enforcement surrendered to authorities in the United States and pleaded no contest to charges that he had leaked sensitive information to drug cartel members who were the targets of ongoing investigations. This officer, who had been vetted and trained by the DEA, who had served as the commander of his unit under a classified operational code name, and who had been trusted with intelligence on some of the most sensitive investigations running in Mexico, had been funneling information to cartel operatives through an encrypted messaging application. The intelligence he provided was not merely operational detail. Among the information he leaked was the identity of a DEA confidential informant who had been working inside a major cartel organization. That informant was subsequently kidnapped and murdered. The officer who provided the identifying information pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison in 2021. His case was not isolated. Current and former DEA agents who worked in Mexico told investigative journalists that at least 2 Mexican supervisors within the Joint Intelligence Program had been assassinated after their identities and locations were leaked to drug traffickers by other members of the same program. The program had been established by Congress specifically to address the problem of corruption endemic to Mexican law enforcement, and it had itself become a vehicle for that corruption. The defense attorney for the convicted officer offered a perspective that, while clearly self-serving, illuminated something genuine about the environment in which these betrayals occurred. He pointed out that law enforcement agents meet with cartel members in Mexico regularly, that cartels routinely pay federal police to arrest their rivals and thereby eliminate competition, and that the line between intelligence gathering and criminal collaboration in an environment where cartel money was available to virtually everyone was a great deal blurrier in practice than it appeared on paper. That blurriness reached its most recent and dramatic expression in late 2025, when a former senior DEA official, a man who had spent nearly 25 years with the agency and had risen to the position of deputy chief of the agency's Office of Financial Operations, was indicted on charges of conspiring to traffic narcotics and launder millions of dollars for one of Mexico's most powerful and violent criminal organizations. The organization in question had been designated by the United States government as a foreign terrorist organization. Earlier in the same year, the former official, according to the indictment, had allegedly met with a confidential law enforcement source posing as a cartel representative and discussed how to move drug proceeds from the United States to Mexico through real estate investments and bulk cash smuggling. He allegedly flashed his former DEA credentials during the meeting. He had allegedly laundered approximately $750,000 in cartel drug proceeds and agreed to facilitate a transaction connected to the importation of over 200 kilograms of cocaine into the United States. Prosecutors alleged the full scheme was designed to launder at least $12 million. The DEA administrator's response was unequivocal. Those who betray the public trust, past or present, will be held to account to the fullest extent of the law. The former official pleaded not guilty, but the charges themselves told a story that the institution could not easily contain. A man who had spent a quarter-century learning everything there was to know about how cartels move and hide money had, upon leaving office, allegedly put that knowledge in the service of the very organizations he had spent his career trying to dismantle. At every stage of this story, the fundamental dynamic is the same. Expertise, access, and institutional knowledge, originally acquired to fight the cartels, had been turned against the institution that created it. The weapon had been seized and redirected. Part 8, The Anatomy of Institutional Betrayal. What the record actually shows. Taken together, these cases, the FBI agent who accepted cartel bribes in the 1980s, the DEA agent convicted as the most corrupt in the agency's history, the Joint Intelligence Commander who sold out an informant to his death, the senior financial operations official charged with laundering cartel proceeds after retirement, do not represent a series of isolated individual failures. They represent a pattern, and the pattern has a structure. The first element of that structure is opportunity. Every agent who ended up on the wrong side of the law in these cases had access to something the cartels desperately needed: intelligence, protection, operational cover, or financial expertise. The cartels are extraordinarily rational actors when it comes to identifying and purchasing these assets. They did not corrupt these agents by accident. They identified vulnerabilities, financial stress, psychological susceptibility, professional nihilism, and exploited them with methodical precision. The second element is inadequate oversight. In virtually every case in this record, the warning signs of corruption were present and either missed or ignored by the institutions responsible for detecting them. The DEA hired an agent who had failed a polygraph and declared bankruptcy. The DEA allowed a group of agents to run international money laundering operations for a decade without adequate financial oversight. The Joint Intelligence Program that was specifically designed to resist cartel corruption was itself corrupted, and the DEA reportedly knew about at least one commander's activities for years before taking action. The third element, and perhaps the most unsettling, is what the former DEA agent described as the institutional nihilism of the drug war. His claim that the overwhelming majority of work trips his group conducted were bogus, that the purpose of the operations had become personal enrichment rather than law enforcement, that dozens of agents and prosecutors participated in a decade-long pattern of misconduct that was effectively normalized within the culture of his unit. These claims were partially corroborated by investigative journalists and by the federal judge who sentenced him. They suggest that corruption was not merely a byproduct of individual weakness, but a consequence of an institutional culture that had lost faith in its own mission. The federal judge who sentenced the most corrupt DEA agent in history did not confine her remarks to that individual. She said the culture of corruption that had incubated his crimes needed to be investigated. She told prosecutors that they were looking at the person who had gotten caught, but that it was apparent to the court that there were others. The Justice Department declined to comment. To date, no other agents have been charged in connection with the conspiracy that generated $9 million in diverted government funds over nearly a decade. The 2020 Inspector General report that reviewed the DEA's oversight of Attorney General exempt operations found that the agency had failed for at least 14 years to file annual reports to Congress as required by law. It documented a fundamental failure of institutional accountability. The report led the DEA's then administrator to order an outside review of the agency's foreign operations. The results of that review, if completed, have not been made public in any comprehensive form. Part 9, what the cartels knew that the agencies did not. Intelligence as a two-way street. One of the most striking aspects of this history, when viewed in its entirety, is how much more the cartels often knew about the law enforcement agencies pursuing them than those agencies understood about themselves. This was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate, sophisticated intelligence operations conducted by organizations that had the resources to sustain them and the ruthlessness to act on the information gathered. The cartel that bribed an FBI agent in the 1980s was not stumbling blindly into corruption. It had developed by the mid-1980s a systematic and nearly corporate approach to corrupting law enforcement on both sides of the border. The payments were catalogued, the officials were categorized by their value and their vulnerability. The operation was treated as a business expense, as a tax on commerce, as a rational investment in operational security. When the organization needed specific outcomes, intelligence on investigations, the neutralization of rivals, the protection of key smuggling routes, it knew exactly which officials to contact and what to offer. The cartel that used a digital hacker to surveil FBI personnel decades later was operating on the same logic with updated technology. Where the earlier organization had identified human vulnerabilities and exploited them with cash, the later organization had identified digital vulnerabilities and exploited them with technical expertise. The targets and the methods had changed. The fundamental intelligence orientation, treat law enforcement as an adversary to be mapped, monitored, and ultimately penetrated, had not changed at all. What made this intelligence orientation particularly effective was the cartel's understanding that law enforcement agencies, like all large institutions, have internal tensions, rivalries, and blind spots. The DEA's inadequate oversight of its financial operations was not a secret to anyone who worked closely with the agency. The tensions between different federal agencies pursuing the same targets, the competition for informants, the reluctance to share intelligence, the jurisdictional disputes that could delay or derail major investigations, were well known to cartel leadership. The organizations exploited these structural weaknesses as systematically as they exploited individual human ones. In testimony before Congress, senior law enforcement officials have repeatedly acknowledged that the major cartels possess intelligence capabilities that rival those of mid-sized nation-states. They have access to former intelligence officers from multiple countries. They employ technical specialists. They conduct counterintelligence operations. They identify and eliminate information leaks, sometimes violently, with a thoroughness that many legitimate intelligence services might envy. The murder of the DEA informant, whose identity was leaked by the corrupted Joint Intelligence Commander, was not an act of blind violence. It was a targeted counterintelligence operation. This is the world in which the agents at the center of this story operated, a world in which the organizations they were fighting knew as much about them as they knew about the organizations, and in some periods knew considerably more. A world in which the war on drugs was not a conventional law enforcement operation, but something closer to an intelligence conflict between two sophisticated adversaries, one operating under legal constraints and institutional oversight, however inadequate, the other operating under no constraints whatsoever and with unlimited access to the financial resources of one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in human history. Part 10. The price of silence, informants, witnesses, and the human cost of institutional betrayal. Behind every compromised intelligence file, every leaked informant identity, every redirected wire transfer in this history, there are human beings who paid the price. Their stories are largely invisible in the court records, and Inspector General reports that document the institutional dimensions of this corruption. They are the anonymous sources who trusted that the government had adequate systems to protect them. They are the cooperating witnesses who were identified and silenced. They are the investigators from other agencies who pursued leads that were being deliberately frustrated by a colleague who was secretly serving their targets. The informant whose identity was leaked by the corrupted Joint Intelligence Commander, the person who was subsequently kidnapped and murdered, had presumably made a calculation when they decided to cooperate with American law enforcement. They had trusted that the system had adequate controls to protect their identity. They had trusted that the Americans who had vetted and trained the officer they were working through had done so rigorously enough to identify any compromised loyalties. They were wrong on every count. The FBI informant whose identity was leaked by the corrupted border agent in the 1980s, and who, according to testimony, had their safety endangered by those leaks, similarly trusted in a system that had failed them. The full consequences of that breach of trust were never publicly documented. The agent retired. The informant's fate remains unrecorded in the public record. The potential FBI sources and cooperating witnesses who were identified through cartel surveillance of an FBI official's digital footprint and who were subsequently intimidated or killed, according to the Justice Department Inspector General report, had no knowledge that the agency's operational security had been compromised. They were taking risks based on a protection that had already been undermined. The report's clinical language, intimidated and in some instances killed, describes human deaths that are the direct consequence of institutional failure. These are not abstractions. They are the most concrete possible expression of what it means when the systems designed to protect those who trust them have been corrupted. Every decision made by a corrupted agent, every bribe accepted, every intelligence file shared with a cartel contact, every redirected wire transfer, each of these actions had consequences that radiated outward from the individual actor into the lives of people who never knew the agent's name and never understood why the protection they had been promised had evaporated. The investigative journalists, prosecutors, and whistleblowers who have worked to document and expose these patterns have done so at considerable personal and professional risk. The DEA agent who became a whistleblower about corruption within his group's operations was, by his own account, subjected to institutional retaliation after he came forward. His attorney described the funding for drug enforcement as essentially a slush fund for corruption, and said that when a whistleblower threatens the organization, it leads to standardized tactics of retaliation. The whistleblower himself said that the second worst day of his life, after his daughter's cancer diagnosis, was the day he reported misconduct to the Justice Department. Part 11. The wider meaning, what this history demands of our institutions. The agent who is the central figure of this investigation, the one whose crimes have been documented, adjudicated, and made part of the public record, is serving a 12-year federal prison sentence. The institutional structures that created him, that overlooked his warning signs, that gave him access to $9 million of government money without adequate oversight, that allowed a culture of corruption to develop within his professional unit over the better part of a decade, those structures remain substantially intact. This is not an argument that the DEA or the FBI are fundamentally corrupt institutions. The overwhelming majority of the people who have served in these agencies have done so with genuine integrity, at genuine personal risk, in pursuit of a genuine public good. The agents who spend years undercover, who sacrifice their personal identities in the service of long-term infiltration operations, who face the constant psychological pressure of living double lives in environments where exposure means death. These are not the agents who appear in this story. They are the ones who make the work of law enforcement against organized crime possible at all. But the record of corruption documented here is not a series of isolated aberrations. It is a pattern, and patterns have causes. The causes in this case include inadequate financial oversight of operations that gave agents access to enormous sums of money. They include a vetting process that allowed demonstrably problematic candidates to access the most sensitive positions in the agency's operations. They include an institutional culture that, in at least some parts of the DEA's international operations, had become so corroded by nihilism about the drug war's prospects that corruption became, in the words of one agent's lawyer, an alternate universe in which it became easier and less suspect to accept money and gifts. They also include the extraordinary capability and resources of the organizations these agencies are fighting. The cartels that bribe, surveil, and infiltrate American law enforcement are not criminal enterprises in the traditional sense. They are transnational corporations with annual revenues in the billions of dollars, with geopolitical influence that extends across multiple national governments, with technical capabilities that rival national intelligence services, and with a rational, unsentimental approach to the acquisition of operational security through the corruption of law enforcement. Against organizations of this scale and sophistication, agencies operating without adequate oversight of their most sensitive functions are fighting at a structural disadvantage. The federal judge who sentenced the most corrupt DEA agent in history told the court that this has to stop. The Inspector General reports that documented years of inadequate oversight of the agency's money laundering operations reached similar conclusions. The congressional testimony of law enforcement, officials who have described cartel surveillance capabilities as existential, implies an awareness at the highest levels of government that something fundamental needs to change. What this history demands in the end is not merely the prosecution of individual agents who cross the line. It demands the kind of institutional reform that makes crossing that line structurally harder. Genuine oversight of the financial operations that give agents access to cartel money. Genuine accountability for the warning signs that should disqualify candidates from sensitive positions. Genuine protection for the whistleblowers who identify misconduct before it becomes catastrophic. And genuine transparency about the scale and nature of the problem that Congress, the public, and the families of murdered informants deserve to understand. The cartels know all of this. They have known it for decades. They have been reading the institutional vulnerabilities of American drug enforcement the way a skilled investor reads a market. Systematically, rationally, and with an eye toward maximum exploitation. The question that this history poses, the question that the agent who betrayed both his FBI colleagues and his cartel associates, who stole from the government that trusted him and from the criminal organization that thought it had purchased him, who ended up serving neither and both. The question that his story poses is whether the institutions charged with fighting this war have finally understood what they are actually up against. Every dollar he stole, every file he compromised, every trust he shattered, these were not merely crimes. They were symptoms of a system that was already broken before he arrived. The only question that matters now is whether the system is willing to honestly reckon with that. The sentence is 12 years. The institutional reckoning has not yet begun.